This is Hidden Killers Week in Review.
A look back at the most prolific stories of the week.
This is a special report from True Crime Today and the Hidden Killers podcast.
I'm Tony Brueski. Thank you for joining us. It is another day of judgment for Alec Murdaugh as he's accepted a plea deal. We're going to take you now to the South Carolina courthouse where that sentencing is taking place, as well as victim impact statements. They'll be read or stated directly to Alec Murdaugh from those that had been wronged by him due to his financial crimes against them. Let's go there right now.
Your Honor, next exhibit I'll hand up is Stage 14. Your Honor, this is the first of the Gloria Satterfield checks to which he is pleading guilty. And this is dated January 7th, 2019, 2021 GS 4730, count 4. He's pleading for this false pretenses and agreeing to a 10-year sentence. And there are two other charges he's pleading that I'll get to here in a minute, but I'm doing these in chronological order. I detailed at the prior proceeding how Gloria Satterfield was the longtime housekeeper for Mr. Murdaugh and his family. Ms. Satterfield's family, her sons trusted Mr. Murdaugh. There had been a long-time family relationship there. Ms. Satterfield in February of 2019, not of February 2019, but Ms. Satterfield had fallen at the Murdaugh home and ultimately passed away. And Mr. Murdaugh approached the family, and some of the Satterfield family is here and is going to address the court. And he approached the family and said, I'm going to help you. I'm going to make sure that Ms. Satterfield's sons are taken care of. And ultimately, I've detailed the entire timeline, which I won't go through extensively here again. But he ultimately involved his friend Corey Fleming. They got an initial recovery of $403,500. Well, that's the ultimate amount he cut to himself. It was $505,000. At that point in time, Tony Satterfield was the PR, but instead of advising Tony that the first recovery had come in, instead they involved Chad Westendorf at Palmetto State Bank, who really served as a patsy. Mr. Fleming and Mr. Murdaugh dealt with Mr. Westendorf and told him they would take care of everything, they would handle everything, they would make sure that the money went to the boys, that this money was being set up for a structure with the boys. Don't worry about communicating with the Satterfields. We've got this. But of course the Satterfields were kept in the dark throughout the entire process. And unlike many of the other schemes where Mr. Murdaugh was able to successfully steal because he had handed a big check to these clients, so therefore they're paying attention to that life-changing money and not realizing what's really going on. In this particular instance, as I will detail, Mr. Murdaugh stole every dime of what ultimately was a very, very large recovery. And I will talk a little bit more about that. And I know I detailed that last time. I'm not going to go through the whole thing again, but suffice it to say that Mr. Murdaugh conspired with his friend Corey Fleming, who he had represent the Satterfields, to get Chad Westendorf, keep him in the dark, keep him as a patsy so that he would not really know what was going on. And ultimately, Mr. Murdaugh was able then to convert sizable portions of this money. And this is the first exhibit right here. This is the first Satterfield one. Again, this is January 9th, 2019, and this ultimately had Corey Fleming cut a check for $403,500 made out just to the single word forge, and then he was able to put that into his fake forge account and ultimately convert that to his own personal use. And what's very interesting about that is if you look on the front on the tracing sheet, you will see the vast majority of that money was used to pay on the sizable loans that Mr. Murdaugh had with Palmetto State Bank that were constantly in danger of going into default. We see a payment for $104,000 on Moselle. We see payments on Redbeard and Zero United. And so again, that money was necessary. Mr. Murdaugh needed to get that money in there, needed to get that money so that he could pay those loans that he had outstanding and stay one step ahead of the game, stay on what I've called an exhausting hamster wheel to stop that thing from coming off the rails. Because the second it comes off the rails, then somebody comes looking and all of this falls apart. And one way that could have happened is if he ultimately were to default on all these loans that he had with Palmetto State Bank. Because if that were to happen, then the bank, no matter how long this relationship had been, is going to be looking at what's been going on here. And so ultimately it was very crucial to get this money in and pay on those particular loans. All right, going in order here, Your Honor, I'm going to come back to the Satterfields. I'm going to hand out what's been marked as States 15. And Your Honor, this was the case of the estate of Blondell Gary. And in this particular instance, and had testimony from her survivor. Her mother, who was Blondell Gary, had passed, and she met with Mr. Murdaugh a week later, and he ultimately settled the case without talking to her. And ultimately, there was some money that was being withheld to determine whether or not another individual was an appropriate beneficiary under this particular case. And that was why it was explained to them that they were withholding this money, but instead of Mr. Murdaugh doing what he said he was going to do, when he was able to withhold that money, he was able then to get it converted to a fake forged check. And we can see on the last page, we can see that forged structure. It says $112,500. And again, and Ms. Gary is sitting there. She's being explained that's why that money is being withheld, but ultimately Mr. Murdaugh was able to convert it to his own use. And again, he had a lot of that to go for his own expenses, for his own cash. Money went to Curtis Eddie Smith. Sizable portions of it went there, as well as a myriad of personal expenses that you can see on the first page of that tracing exhibit. Your Honor, for that particular crime, he's pleading to 2021 GS 4733, count 2, money laundering, $100,000 or more, for which he's agreed to a 20-year sentence. State's Exhibit 16. This is the big one, Your Honor. This is the check from the big recovery that Alec Murdaugh, in collusion with Corey Fleming, were able to get in the Satterfield case. And ultimately, after Mr. Fleming took his sizable legal fees, had a check cut from the Moss-Coon and Fleming trust account for $2,961,931.95 and made out to the single word forge, and then had that personally delivered to Alec Murdaugh, who then was able to convert every dime of that money for his own personal use. And again, throughout all of that, and so all of this came to light till after the side of the road and people started looking, ultimately the Satterfields had never saw one thin dime of that money. They never received one thin dime of the money that went through Corey Fleming, that went through Alec Murdaugh. And it was all converted for his personal use, this particular check. Your Honor, for that particular crime, he's pleading, again, 2021 GS 4730, count 5 to money laundering, $100,000 or more. That's a 20-year sentence, and that will be the lead sentence for the case. I will get to later the additional 7 consecutive years. That's the other lead sentence that will total that 27 years of 85% time. But this 2.9, by far being the biggest amount, is one of the lead sentences in the particular case. And again, you can see how this money and the extensive amount of work that was done that was to trace how that money ultimately was spent. But just to give some examples, we have a payment of, look on page 2, Your Honor, a payment on of over $609,000 on a loan on which his father was a co-signer at the bank. We see a $500,000 payment on a loan relating to Moselle. We see over $132,000 going to C.E. Smith. We see repayments to one of his law partners of over $304,000. We see payments to his father for a loan for $385,000. We also see payment on a credit card down at the bottom there of $146,968.06. So again, stealing this money, we're getting to a critical point for Mr. Murdaugh. Stealing this money was necessary, again, to keep afloat and to pay back all these extensive loans that he had taken from the bank, to pay back these loans he had taken from his father, to pay back these loans he had taken from his law partners, to pay back six-figure credit card balances, as well as all the other expenditures that are listed on there. Next one I'll hand up to Your Honors is State 17. And the victim in this particular case is Christopher Anderson. And Your Honor, he's pleading to 2021 GS 4734 count 2, money laundering $100,000 or more, to which he's agreed to a 20-year sentence. And ultimately, in this particular case, he was able to convert through a disbursement statement that just said settlement proceeds to Forge $750,000. And once he had that amount made out to Forge, and again this check was on February 20th, 2020, he was then able to convert this money to his own personal use. And you can see the tracing exhibit on the front, all the personal expenses that were being paid through that money, a lot of online withdrawals and banking transfers, but also payments to Palmetto State Bank loans for over $104,000, a lot of money going to Curtis Eddie Smith, and then just general other personal expenditures. Next one I'll hand up is States 18. And this is the final Satterfield check, Your Honor. Again, over a year has gone by from the $2.9 million check, from that $3.8 million settlement. Again, the Satterfield family is unaware that a single dime has been recovered. And ultimately, there's still money remaining in the Moss, Kuhn, and Fleming trust account. And so Alec Murdaugh, in October again of 2020, has a check cut by Corey Fleming from the Moss, Kuhn, and Fleming trust account for $118,000 made out to just the single word Forge and delivered to him, which he then converts to his own use. You can see cash withdrawals of over $22,000. You can see over $28,000 to Eddie Smith, as well as other expenditures. And this, of course, is around the time also that they then have the stipulation of dismissal signed in the Satterfield case that doesn't have the caption. They do not advise the attorneys for either Nautilus or the prior insurance companies. Instead, Corey Fleming signs it, and he has Alec Murdaugh, the defendant, not the defense attorney, but the defendant himself, sign that stipulation dismissal in conjunction with having this forged check cut to Mr. Murdaugh for $118,000. Your Honor, that is 2021 GS 4730 count 8, to which he's also pleading to money laundering $100,000 or more and agreeing to a 20-year sentence. Next one is States 19. This is the estate of Sandra Taylor. This one really gets to me, and her mother, Elise Mallory, testified. Her daughter was killed by a drunk driver, leaving behind 3 minor children. And I've talked to her extensively, and she went to Mr. Murdaugh because she heard he was the best in town. And he kept telling her and lowering over and over again how much the case was worth. And if there ever was a more acute example of trust, it was Miss Mallory and Mr. Murdaugh. She put this case in his hands, and he kept coming back and saying that the case was worth less and less and less, until eventually he told her that the case was only going to be worth $30,000, $10,000 for each one of those children. And she believed him, because like many people, $30,000 is a lot of money. The reality is that Mr. Murdaugh, with his insatiable need for cash, settled that case for $183,528 because he needed the money. And then he had a disbursement sheet that wasn't signed by Miss Mallory, executed, in which he put on their attorney's fees of $30,000. You can see that on the last page. And then had the rest of the money, $152,866, made out to Forge, and then converted that money to his own benefit. And that was on November 30th, 2020. $23,500 of that was cash withdrawals for his benefit. $29,000 went to C.E. Smith, and then more went to other versions of that name. Paid $20,000 on a credit card. And Miss Mallory, those children, like the Satterfields, who were also the most prime example of trust in this case, the people that trusted him more than anyone, the Satterfields and Miss Mallory, like the Satterfields, she didn't get one thin dime of that money. And Mr. Murdaugh even went so far as to go back to the firm and say, hey, I feel bad that I wasn't able to get that much from Miss Mallory. Can we refund the $30,000 to her? Because he told her that. He said, I can only get $30,000 in this case, and because, out of the goodness of my heart, I'm not going to take a legal fee. That's what he told her. Out of the goodness of my heart, I'm not going to take a legal fee. I'm just going to get you that $30,000. But the problem was he'd already dispersed the money. He'd already dispersed the $30,000 to the firm. And he went back to the firm and said, and telling them a different lie, telling them, hey, I would like to just refund that $30,000. I don't want to take a fee. Just refund that to her. Obviously what he was going to do was then give her that $30,000, which is what he had promised her was going to be the recovery all along. But the firm was like, no, the fees are paid. No, we're not doing that. And so Miss Mallory never got one dime. For that crime, Mr. Murdaugh is pleading to 2021 GS 4738, count 2, money laundering, $100,000 or more. And he is agreeing to that, to a 7-year sentence that is consecutive to the 20-year sentence of 2021 GS 4730, count 5. And those would, again, be the lead sentences for the total of 27 years at 85% time as a result of this plea here today. Your Honor, our next exhibit, Exhibit 20. In this particular instance, this was another instance in which Mr. Murdaugh was able to steal fees from the firm. This particular matter, he represented the individual, and ultimately he had cut 2 disbursement sheets. Number 1 at the very last page of this exhibit in the disbursement sheet, he had the PMPED attorney's fee, and then in parentheses the word forge for $83,333.33. Your Honor, that was from May 12th, 2021. And that particular fee made out to forge, instead of going into the firm as it should, it was made out to fake forge, and Alec again was able to convert that money to his own use, cash withdrawals, payments to associates, the standard things that we see. He also had a second disbursement sheet cut in which it said forge on it, $91,867.50. That check was cut on December 16th, 2020. And again, ultimately, those were cut from the client trust account. Should have represented legal fees, but instead were diverted by Mr. Murdaugh into his forge account and converted to his personal use. And it's that last sheet, Your Honor, that where it says attorney's fees forge, that along with one of the ones I'm about to talk about next, the Ferris matter, or the matter involving Chris Wilson, those were two of the things that the firm had started to notice as everything started to come apart. And Your Honor, of course, has heard about the confrontation, the discussions between Jeannie Seckinger and Annette Griswold and Mr. Murdaugh about where the Ferris fees were. But the other thing that had caught staff's attention, that had caught Jeannie Seckinger's attention, was this Hirschberger matter and whether or not some fees had been diverted there. And it was not until months after the murders that a couple of things happened at the same time. The firm, Jeannie Seckinger, was looking back at this Hirschberger matter, concerned about what that was. Around that same time, Annette Griswold found the actual Ferris check that had been made out to Mr. Murdaugh instead of the firm. And what I'm going to talk about here in a minute, Thomas Moore, they started to look around, and that led them to identify the initial fake forge matters that led to them confronting Alec, terminating him, announcing that he had been stealing money, to which he's admitting today. And of course, the side of the road followed not long after that. Your Honor, for that, the Hirschberger matter, he's pleading to 2022 GS 4724 count 3, false pretenses, and agreeing to a 10-year sentence. Next exhibit I will hand up is Exhibit 21. Your Honor, this one is the matter involving Thomas Moore. In this instance, he was representing Mr. Moore, who had been injured in a wreck. Mr. Moore is a trooper who had been injured in the line of duty. Ultimately, Mr. Murdaugh had arranged for a recovery, did not advise Mr. Moore, did not tell him money had come in, and had a disbursement sheet cut for $125,000, you can see on the last page. Ultimately forged Mr. Moore's signature on there, and then had that dispersed to fake forge. This was on January 29th, 2021. And ultimately, you can see on the first page how a lot of that money was being dispersed, including to cash withdrawals, various iterations of the name Eddie Smith, the cash services business for $14,000, and other matters as well. For that, Your Honor, he's pleading to 2021 GS 4727 count 2, money laundering, 20 years or more. Again, all of these 20-year money launderings are 85% offenses, and ultimately he's pleading guilty to that one as well. Next hand up, State's Exhibit 22. Your Honor, this is the matter involving Chris Wilson. And as Your Honor will recall, Mr. Murdaugh had split this case with his friend Chris Wilson and another attorney. They had tried the case in, I believe, December of 2020, and bench tried it and had received a sizable recovery in the early months of 2021. Mr. Murdaugh, again, was in a desperate position needing cash and could not have these fees going to the firm because, again, the way the firm payment structure worked would be that he would not receive the majority of that money until the end of 2021 when the firm paid its overhead, settled up on its agreement, and then split up the remaining monies based on each attorney's individual contribution to that year's revenue. And ultimately, he had, on March 10th, 2021, a check cut for $192,000, March 23rd, 2021, $375,000, and April 20th, 2021 for $225,000, and had those all made out from the Chris Wilson's trust account representing the fees that should have gone to the firm, and had those made out to him personally and deposited it and spent for his own personal use. And it was those particular checks that led to, when the expenses came in, led to the whole inquiry from the firm PMPED back to Chris Wilson's office on where are the fees? Where are the fees? We got the expense check. And Your Honor, of course, has heard testimony about that issue percolating and the fact that it was even discussed on June 7th, 2021. And after June 7th, 2021, of course, no one was really paying attention to those matters anymore for a number of months. And one of the things that Mr. Murdaugh was able to do was borrow money from a law partner, and was able to borrow money from the bank, and got $600,000 and sent that back to Chris Wilson, and then told Chris Wilson a lie. Pretty much said, hey, I got some things moving around. I'm going to send you the $600 right now. I'll get you the $192. But can you go ahead and tell the firm that all that money is in your trust account, which would solve the problem, because then that would stop the inquiry. And so ultimately that happened. Chris Wilson sent an email and said, those monies are in my trust account. And when, of course, everything crashed and burned following Labor Day of 2021, Mr. Wilson confronted Mr. Murdaugh, and Mr. Murdaugh admitted that he had been stealing and admitted that he didn't have that $192,000. And ultimately, those were the basis for the indictments in 2021 GS 4728, counts 1, which represents the diversion of the fees from the firm of $792,000, pleading to false pretenses on that for a 10-year sentence, and then count 7 representing that 192, not to double count it, but representing the 192 that he defrauded his friend Chris Wilson out of, and that's false pretenses to which he's agreeing to a 10-year sentence. Your Honor, additionally, Mr. Murdaugh is pleading to 2022 GS 4710, count 1, and that is a criminal conspiracy, Your Honor, between him and Curtis Eddie Smith. And the dates are from October 2013 through February 2021, and ultimately those deal with the conversion of a lot of these funds from whatever source through checks to Curtis Eddie Smith. They're related to a lot of illegal purposes, including narcotics. That total being at least $2,413,754.79. Finally, Your Honor, Mr. Murdaugh is pleading to 2022 GS 4734 count 9, and that represents his willful evasion of taxes for all of this ill-gotten gains, and that total from all those years is $619,391. Those are the crimes to which he's pleading here today and the result of the exhaustive investigation that's been done here. And Your Honor, there were 101 offenses. And people might say, why are we resolving this in this manner? And the reason for that, there are a lot of reasons for that. Ultimately, we're having here a guilty plea in which Mr. Murdaugh is admitting his guilt, and we have gone and been able to detail the manner in which the system was abused. Mr. Murdaugh is waiving his appellate rights, and within the law, his post-conviction rights, which means for this plea here today, there is certainty, as much as the law will allow, that he will serve at least 85% of that 27-year sentence if Your Honor ultimately accepts this result. Whatever happens with any other litigation, we ensure with this result here today that Mr. Murdaugh will stay in state prison for what is most likely the remainder of his life. And that's aside from the 2 life sentences that Your Honor previously imposed upon him. But we have to remember that this result here today is not for the murders. This result here today is for those white-collar offenses. And 27 years at 85%, Your Honor, is more than anyone can think of, state or federal, that someone has received for white-collar offenses. It's more than Enron. It's more than WorldCom. It's more than Carolina Investors. It represents a singular accountability for white-collar offenses, the likes of which no one can find another example, state or federal, throughout the country. It spares a lot of these smaller counties what Colleton County already had to endure, and that is the expense in some of these smaller counties with less resources of these trials. It spares these victims those trials and gives them accountability here today, and means that ultimately we can be assured that there is an accountability for Mr. Murdaugh solely for the white collar, unlike anything anyone has seen. And we can be assured that he's not leaving state prison. He's staying in South Carolina State Prison where he belongs, because these were South Carolina crimes committed in South Carolina courtrooms just like this one here, and South Carolina state court actions before South Carolina judges just like you, Your Honor. Those are some of the reasons why this is a unique result, an appropriate result. Because although Mr. Murdaugh is facing an accountability just for white-collar offenses, unlike perhaps anyone ever, the course of conduct that we've identified through all of those exhibits lasting for all that time period involving so many victims in amounts that may have been insignificant to him but were massive to them. The wreckage that he has left through the legal system, the distrust of the legal system that he has caused, deserve a singular accountability more than anyone has ever heard of. And that is why this sentence is appropriate. Ultimately, the firm, PMPED, who I mentioned, has been very cooperative with this investigation. The bank has been very cooperative with this investigation. And we've indicted, in investigating this case, we've indicted the individuals that the grand jury found probable cause that there was criminality, which is a different thing from civil liability. And Your Honor knows there's all kinds of civil actions and civil matters that still remain associated with the wreckage and the morass that this man has caused. And that is not, all of that is not for this courtroom here today. This is to resolve criminality. And ultimately, the firm has paid net amounts back to the victims that I've discussed here today. And that is not to say that those victims may still have claims outstanding. It is only to say that they have paid back net amounts. And in many instances, that would be the exact amount that Alex stole from them. Not dealing with other issues that may be out there, like the loss of the money for all that period of time, or the appropriateness of attorney's fees or things like that. Those are for a different forum. The firm has, though, cooperated. The firm has paid those net amounts back to those victims so that none of them are currently empty-handed. Doesn't mean that anyone was ever made whole by what this man has done, because I don't know that that's possible. Ultimately, Your Honor, I want to hand up a couple more exhibits. Your Honor, this is simply a sheet that has been provided by the law firm, going through a number of those victims, monies that they have paid, those net amounts, other costs to them. And again, this is not to settle on a restitutionary figure. This is just to give Your Honor an example of some of the expenditures that are out there. And I've discussed this with the defense. I'm giving these figures up to Your Honor, but assuming that this plea gets accepted here today, our plan is to ultimately work with the defense and with all the various parties to come up with a figure that is appropriate for a restitutionary amount, even though we all know that in the end, the well is dry, and the well was bled dry by this man. This next exhibit details the tax liability and the amounts I identified before, representing the loss to the state of South Carolina for the tax revenue. This next exhibit, which was an exhibit at the murder trial as well, Exhibit 25, represents the confession of judgment to the Satterfields for $4,305,000. And the final two exhibits are sort of summaries of some of that related to the criminality in this courtroom today. And again, I want to be clear, the criminality in this courtroom today is to address the victims for which there are indictments and not to address all the claims that may be out there, all the claims that some of these victims may have, all the claims that the parties may have with each other. That's not the purpose of a criminal proceeding, but this is an effort for today's purposes, for acceptance of this plea, for exposure to the world of the extent of damage wrought by Alec-Murdaugh, to put some numbers on it. And if we look at that first example, if we look at those various factors that I've identified, we see a total of $12,425,254.32. There have been some offsetting claims as it relates to the firm, and if you account for those, we're looking at $8,548,488.26. To say numbers like that out loud, to detail these involved schemes for this period of time, is unique and unprecedented and calls for a unique and unprecedented sentence of 27 years. Your Honor, I do have a number of victims and their representatives who would like to speak, and I believe our first one would be Eric Bland. I believe the mic right there is working, and this time I would, with the court's permission, allow these victims to address the court.
Prior to proceeding, we will take a 10-minute recess.
This has been a special report from True Crime Today and the Hidden Killers podcast.